What about that person over there?
I don't know. What do I say?
Just go up and be yourself and don't sound desperate.
All right. Hey, excuse me. I was just over there and I saw you and I thought you looked pretty chill.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you're into talking.
Yeah, I like talking.
Cool. Well, if you're not busy, I was just wondering if maybe you want to get together sometime and have an hour-long conversation.
Are you asking me if I want to start a podcast with you?
I mean, what if I was?
Oh my gosh, that bathroom line is crazy. Who's this guy?
Is this guy trying to start a podcast with you?
Relax, he didn't know.
Are you guys already in a podcast with each other?
We've been in a committed podcast for over 300 episodes, pal.
We actually have a studio and 3 sponsors.
I'm sorry.
Get away from my co-host.
Okay, are you ready to go? Sure. In that case, allow me to welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony. Doesn't really include tutors in his cubesmatics.
It's true, I don't.
End of episode.
So I don't know what I have to contribute, so take it away.
Well, no, it's interesting that we have not actually talked about tutors at all before, and a big reason is because for a long time I also didn't include any tutors in my cubes, and we'll talk about maybe why you don't, why I didn't. But I have 2 cube projects recently I've been working on, both my 100 Ornithopters project and also the Neoclassical cube, which is now like a year and a half old from when I first started making that list, that I've been aggressively pursuing tutors in. And I feel like I have a new perspective on them and where I think they do and don't belong. I think it's worth us actually covering tutors as a topic as a whole episode.
Are you sure this isn't just about you being super mad that you built your whole deck around one card this night at Cube Night, this week at Cube Night,
bring
and
this up.
Never drew it?
I wasn't even going to mention this. This was not even on my list of things to talk about.
Really?
It truly wasn't. I don't like getting salty at Cube Night, but it was a really rough night. Pac-1 picked one, Staying Power, which is an uncard that says any effect that would otherwise end at the end of turn or this turn just happens indefinitely.
This to me is like one of my favorite types. Like, this is what I think the unsets have done really well, where it's like a card that definitely cannot exist for lots of complicated reasons, but it does something kind of interesting with the rules and changes a lot of cards.
It's actually mechanical,
and you can
instead
mechanically you can mostly figure out what it does. There's like some confusing interactions, but mostly you can figure out how it works. So that's what I feel like is the coolest thing that they've done with the silver bordered or acorn space. So I throw a couple of these in 1 or 2 of my cubes now and then.
This one specifically is in your cube that has more of these weirdo oddball cards that you have for this exact purpose. And I don't know, I tried to live what I thought was the dream of that cube. You Pac-1, pick one, a weird card, you build your whole deck around it, and it just, I drew it once, I cast it, and immediately got destroyed by Reclamation Sage.
Oh, that's even worse than never drawing
I didn't draw it the rest of the night, and then I also just lost to other people's dumb crap that they happened to draw. It's like, I couldn't even draw my one card, and I saw Sal on 3 separate occasions use Ulvenwald Tracker to make his Phyrexian Obliterator fight somebody else's creature. He drew both of them and cast them, and they didn't get removed, and he untapped with them 3 separate times.
I mean,
it's funny Staying Power once.
You were very grumpy about this cube, and I'm looking at like exactly that and thinking like, success! This cube did exactly what I want, where these like weird, wacky interactions are coming together.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, like I don't think the cube is not meeting your goals. I think a lot of the fun is in the draft, and the games are kind of stupid.
Well, I mean, but it's funny because I had exactly the opposite experience where I felt like I completely ruined the draft. Like, there were just so many packs that there was just not even cards in my colors after I had felt early in the draft that I had identified sort of what the table was doing pretty well.
It turns out you had.
It turns out I had, and it was just...
It was a 4-player draft, small card pool.
Yeah,
it's easier for things to get weird.
That's true. So I just felt like my deck was like really unfocused and not really working, but then I ended up 3-0ing, and it was cool that every game felt really different, and I had to like piece together wins in different ways, including beating the aforementioned Phyrexian Obliterator with Ulvenwald Tracker. And yeah, just like being able to navigate those puzzles is exactly what I wanted from this particular game.
I mean, your games against me were not a puzzle.
Yeah, I had to not cast the Acrone War until you played your Archangel of Thune.
That was a different game. I don't know. I think the cube is interesting in that it does make the draft exciting. I was literally like giggling uncontrollably during the draft.
Maybe you just only have so much net happiness on a night.
I mean, I just open prismatic strands and I'm like, okay, so I can
prevent all damage from 2 particular colors forever
for the rest of the game.
Uh-huh.
And I was, just giggling. And then, I had Selfless Spirit, which was really cool. It was really interesting thinking about how it works with the Knight of the Holy Nimbus, because it's got flanking, so anything that blocks it will get -1/-1 perpetually, which is very good. But then also it has this regeneration clause where it regenerates all the time automatically, but a player can pay once to prevent that regeneration till end of turn, which means they only have to pay once and it's prevented indefinitely for the rest of time.
Yeah.
But also, you probably only pay once for that anyway.
Only do it once. I guess it's like slightly a disadvantage in that if somebody just happens to have 2 random mana,
they can change the timing of it.
Yeah.
I think it's bigger than a slight disadvantage.
Okay, yeah, that's probably true.
So that card, I was like, it's probably net neutral. Anyway, I guess the question is like, what are your goals for the cube? Is it because your deck wasn't doing anything particularly novel or like irregular? Like you just happen to have a decent deck.
I was flipping Gathen Raiders and discarding my Vampire with Madness. I thought that was cool.
But that's not... The Madness is a normal theme of that without any irregular cards.
Irregular is more of a vibe than a, Don't worry about it. Who does that? Who casts a Vampire off Madness with Gathen Raiders?
I think a lot of people that have Madness themes in their cubes.
Huh. Okay.
I don't know. I think it's pretty common.
Let's go check out Gathen Raiders real quick.
Anyway, I felt like the cube lived up to what I understood its promise to be, which is like very exciting draft, potentially very off the beaten path decks. Like I drafted totally differently. I packed 1 pick 2 startling development, which I didn't end up playing because I ended up mono white, but I was just like, I'm going to force staying power and see what happens. Try and like follow the cube spirit. And yeah, I mean, I built my entire deck around a 1 of that I had no way to tutor for, and I had no card draw, no card selection, and also incidentally, 0 removal. I was the only player in white, and there was not a single white removal spell, to my knowledge, opened in our 4-player draft, and so...
Yeah, I don't know what happened
I realized how much it's so depressing to me to have my opponent just play a Crypt Breaker on turn 1 and be like, well, I guess you just have that forever now. Like, I'm literally never getting rid of that for the rest of the game.
Unless you prevent all damage from black sources forever.
I didn't get to do that, though, is the point.
So do you think you would have had a better time if this cube included tutors?
I would have had a better time if it was the regular cube. Your regular cube is a masterpiece. I don't know why you don't bring it out all the time. I don't know. I was also...
We gotta mix it up a little bit.
I was also in a regular cube mood, and then you were like, oh, but I brought the irregular cube, and I was like, okay, great, cool. Can't wait to force something cool, get smoked by some broken thing that my opponent happens to draw into every time. Sick. Anyway, like I said, I'm embarrassed by being salty of it. I shouldn't be salty about it, but it was a rough night of Magic. I'm straight up not having a good time, is what I kept saying to myself.
You said it to yourself and to everyone else. And you also just like really just ate my segue there.
We're talking about tutors, Anthony. Let's first just define a tutor.
I think that's a great idea.
Every episode is someone's first episode. Maybe we have newer Magic players out there that don't know the long history of what the word tutor means in this specific context.
So, tutors go all the way back to Alpha, and the name comes from the original tutor, Demonic Tutor, which is just 1 and a black for a sorcery that lets you search your library for any card at all of your choice and put it into your hand. And this was sort of a thing they did a lot, I mean, still to some degree, but especially in older Magic. So then they followed that up shortly after with a cycle of other cards, including Enlightened Tutor, that is a little bit more restrictive and just lets you search for instants or sorceries. Just lets you search for artifacts or enchantments, or Mystical Tutor, that's the blue one that lets you get instant sorceries. Vampiric Tutor is the black one. It can get anything, but it deals you some damage. So it's like they're trying to make these tutors that are a little bit more flavorful to the color pie.
I guess it never occurred to me that really is kind of one cycle, but it's spread out across multiple sets, because you get Visions as Vampiric Tutor. Does Visions come before or after Mirage, chronologically?
After.
So we had, first was Enlightened and Mystical.
And Worldly.
And Worldly. And then there was Vampiric, and then a little later we got Gamble, which I think, to my understanding, is the last piece of that cycle.
Feels like
that was Urza's Saga.
So they're doing this thing where they're referencing the old card mechanically and also using this name tutor again and again to say you're tutoring something from your library, and then obviously the players have adopted that language as well. So even though they haven't made a lot of things that say tutor in the name anymore, we still call things that search up at particular cards from your library, whether that is with some restriction or unrestricted, to your hand or to the top of your library, even, maybe other zones, still call those tutors.
Yeah, so that's what the word has come to mean in Magic circles. And again, like everything, this is kind of a gray area, and you can kind of stray further and further from Demonic Tutor, which I think we'll consider the canonical tutor, any card to your hand. And you can start to be like, okay, well, is Evolving Wilds a tutor?
Yeah.
Not
I was actually
really. That's just mana fixing. Something else on the spectrum, I think, is like you play Sphinx Summoner in the regular cube, which is definitely a tutor, but it's a tutor for a very narrow set of things.
Specifically an artifact creature, which is like a dozen options in the cube, maybe less than that even.
Yeah, I'm not even sure it's a dozen, so it probably is, including the colorless ones, yeah.
Yeah, I was actually a little bit surprised. I went on Scryfall and searched for O-Tag Tutor just to find everything that user submitted tags marked something as a tutor, and it's almost 1,000 cards, which kind of surprised me. And then looking through it, it's like, oh yeah, a lot of these things are finding a specific land, or even, they're from a Planeswalker deck and they search for exactly one copy of a pretty bad Planeswalker because that was a thing.
They did a lot of that in Planeswalker decks, yeah.
So filtering out some of those tutor lands and a couple of other things, there's still like 500 or so cards that relatively, with some degree of conditionality, let you search up cards from your library.
So the cards that you and I have both included in our cubes, I think from the beginning, are some of the more narrow in scope or conditional tutors that don't just go get you any card. I have never played Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, Mystical Tutor in any of my cubes until I started the Neoclassical cube a year and a half ago. To my knowledge, you've never put any of those in a cube. Did you have like the tutors in like your mono black cube when you had it?
I don't think so, but I have played some of the more restrictive ones that may be something like a Recruiter of the Guard that just gives you a small creature, things like that. But none of the unrestricted ones have I really played in any cubes.
Right, so the ones we have played, right, like I've been on Green Sun Zenith forever in my cube. That, I think, very much falls in the tutor space. Stoneforge Mystic, I run, you include in at least the Turbo Cube.
Oh, that is in the Turbo Cube.
So there's definitely cards like that. You have Tribute Mage in the regular cube, and I'm assuming also the Turbo Cube. You have a couple of mages in the Turbo Cube.
Yes.
Knight of the Reliquary is your highlight card for your regular cube. That is definitely a tutor.
If you want to call tutoring up lands?
Well, I think that one's different from just an Evolving Wilds or whatever, because it gets any land, and specifically you will want to build around it by having good non-basics. And so I think that is much more in the tutor spectrum than just a fetch land is. We mentioned Sphinx Summoner already. Goblin Engineer you include in the regular cube.
I do. That one's actually really fun to play with.
That one's an example of a tutor that tutors to the graveyard.
Yes.
It goes and entombs any, here we are with more magic lingo, it goes and entombs any artifact from your deck, and then
so it puts
is
it in the graveyard, but
limited
then
scope Goblin Welder.
Also, has that ability to get it out of the graveyard, so it's like a couple extra steps, but you can get something into play from your library eventually.
I've also played with Elvish Reclaimer and Golos and other things over the years, and I'm sure there's other ones I'm not thinking of from the Bun Magic Cube that are in this soft tutor space that has never been a problem for me. I've never looked at these cards and thought these don't fit my cube design goals. And a lot of these cards I really like because they allow for very dynamic drafting where because you have one specific card in your pool, other very specific cards go up substantially in power level. As compared to the regular way that drafting a card changes your card evaluation, it's very subtle, right? Like, if I have a burn spell, I'll look slightly more highly at another red card. If I have a couple of 1-drops, I'll look slightly more highly at other 1-drops because they are going to, at a certain density, allow me to be very aggressive. If I have a bunch of removal spells, I'll favor other removal spells less highly because I already have enough of that effect. These sort of subtle changes to your card evaluations are a huge part of drafting and what makes it interesting. And having these soft tutors just means that you can kind of turn that up to the next level, where now if I have Green Sun Zenith, a green creature with conditional but very relevant abilities, things like Scavenging Ooze or Jarael, Manavuli... We ever figure out how to pronounce that word?
Nope.
Jarael the Recluse... an Eternal Witness even, like a lot of these cards just go up substantially in my ratings in the draft once I have a Green Sun Zenith, because it turns that Green Sun Zenith into a second copy of any of those cards, and when the graveyard matters, I can go and get my Scavenging Ooze, or if I just want a mana sink, when I need to get back a key card, I can go get Eternal Witness, and that flexibility is worth a lot. And that's on top of the kind of base rate flexibility of Green Sun Zenith, just letting you get a on-curve threat, or, a 1-pip off-curve threat, but it's a scalable threat, basically, that Green Sun Zenith in your deck. So I really like those cards for that reason, right? And I've found a lot of success in, playing an equipment package with Stoneforge Mystic, playing various non-basic land packages alongside Golos, playing utility or conditionally good green creatures alongside Green Sun Zenith. I think another example of Green Sun Zenith utility is just playing really good gold creatures that happen to also be green. Leovold is a card that... Is it still in the Bun Magic Cube, or did I cut it? It is still in the Bun Magic Cube. The Sultai Leovold, so the casting cost blue, black, green for the 3/3 with all the powerful hate abilities in your opponent. That's a great card if you can cast it, and it's so much easier to cast it when you can cast it for 3 and a green in a lot of decks. And so I think those cards just go up a lot when you have Green Sun Zenith in your deck because it's a lot of ways an easier time to cast a card that is otherwise difficult to cast.
Right, I mean, that's also a good example because that card is situationally very powerful, both depending on the matchup and depending on the particular board state. So that makes it a much more flexible card. If you have your Green Sun Zenith and your opponent has a bunch of cards in hand, you might want to stop them, or they have a bunch of removal in their hand, you might want to get that Leovold rather than just getting something that's like a more proactive threat. And that modality is really powerful.
Yeah, and just to say it, because I know that we'll get some comments, I also have Grist, and Grist is a really cool thing you can get with Green Sun Zenith that then gives you Planeswalker effect on the board and Planeswalker-esque abilities.
Because Grist is just bugs.
So I've really liked these cards for this reason, right? And I would describe some of these as focal cards of my cube for years. Like I have focused for years on making Green Sun Zenith good, on making Stoneforge Mystic good, and tuning exactly the ways in which they are good to make sure that it's fitting my gameplay goals. But at no point was it ever like, oh, I should not include Green Sun Zenith or Stoneforge Mystic because they're tutors and tutors are not what I'm going for. But for years, I have excluded Demonic Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Worldly Tutor, Vampiric Tutor. I'm not even sure Worldly would be any good in the Bun Magic Cube, but those other three I think would be very good. Demonic Tutor, Mystical Tutor, and Vampiric Tutor. I've excluded those because I had this bias for a very long time that just said I didn't want to play with tutors, like capital T tutors. The soft ones are okay, the ones that are really narrow in scope are okay, but as soon as you're just getting any card, my fear was that you would just end up with decks that played much too consistently, and you'd have one power outlier you could just go and get every single time, and that would remove a lot of the fun and strategy from playing with the deck.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely where I'm still at for most of my cubes as well, where, I mean, just talking about the draft we did last week, it was very fun to me that my deck did different things every time, and I had to solve a different puzzle every time. And I did have a couple, pretty big power outliers in my deck, like Fiery Confluence and the Akroan War, and if I had an unconditional tutor that would just let me get one of those every time, I feel like the games would just play out more similarly. It would just be like, yep, I'm going to get my best card, and we're going to do this twice as often because I have essentially 2 copies of it now.
Yes, you had cards that were better than other cards in your deck, certainly. That's just the nature of the regular cube. You had that stupid goblin that just tapped to deal 1 to an opponent every turn, alongside the Akroan War and Fiery Confluence. So there's a big delta in just raw card quality there. But I don't think there was one card that you would say, like, well, I'm always going to tutor for this, right? Because you had a couple of good cards that were conditionally good. It wasn't like you were just always going to get Fiery Confluence. Now, you would if your opponent was at 6, but if your opponent had a big board and you were in a stall, maybe you go and get the Magus of the Future, or you go and get Talrand because you have a handful of spells, right? Like, I'm not convinced that you would have just gone and gotten the same card every single time.
Yeah, fair. Okay, so but
I would have in my deck because I built my whole deck around staying power. Even if it was wrong, I would have gone and gotten it every time.
So that's the whole argument. Just to put the argument out there on one end of the spectrum is you might not be interested in playing tutors because if your cube is singleton, you're doing that for a reason because you want the variety, you want lots of cards to show up and be relevant in games, and there is this theoretical possibility that especially these powerful unconditional, very efficient tutors will just make the games play out much more similarly.
And that is the concept that I have come to be very skeptical of in the past year and a half as I have designed cubes with a lot of tutors in them.
What kind of cubes?
Let's talk about those cubes. The one that I started doing this in was the Neoclassical cube. This is my primarily old school cube. It is all old school vibes. I do allow myself to play new cards whenever I feel like it's appropriate, so it's not strictly all old border, but all of the archetypes are old border archetypes. It's just there's sometimes new cards there to support those old border archetypes. And from the beginning, I was like, I am definitely including the tutors in this cube, and I don't even really know exactly why I did. I was like, Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Enlightened Tutor.
I mean, they were
I just put in from the beginning.
And iconic, and that was a big part of the sort of design of this was just to hit that flavor.
It was, and I was also very happy to play a wider power level band. Like I think of my Bun Magic cube, my primary cube, as a exercise in restraint and care to the kinds of games that can happen, such that I think it very much narrows the range of what's possible in terms of the scope of games. And I want them to be these tight strategic games where resources matter, decisions matter. And in order to achieve that, I have sacrificed a lot of variety. Like that's just the case, right? there's only so much range in what you can draft and do in the Bun Magic Cube, because if you could draft a much wider range, then there would be way more games that just ended because somebody drafted a way better deck and someone drafted a way worse deck, and there's just a non-game there. That's a decision I've made in that environment. The Neoclassical Cube, from the beginning, I was like, I'm okay if there are much swingier things happening here. Partially because it feels more appropriate for old school Magic, which is a whole other topic we can talk about sometime when we talk more about that cube. I think those kind of games and swingy moments just feel more old school Magic to me. But also because, yeah, these cards are iconic. They are a big part of, I think, Magic's identity from the early days. But also, I had this idea that I'm not going to play cards that feel like new power level outliers, right? The idea of having a demonic tutor in my cube and I just go and get Oko every single time, that is what I really don't like about tutors. And again, how much that would actually happen in a given cube deck, I'm not sure, but
I think a lot.
Maybe. But that's what I was wanted to avoid. And if you're describing that problem, the cards I'm not going to include in this cube are the Okos. There should be nothing resembling Oko where it's just like a self-contained value engine that just takes over the game with no other commitment. And I think I've kind of succeeded in that cube. There's a lot of broken things you can do, but it requires you to have drafted your deck in a specific way. It requires you to play a lot of dinky cards that are bad in isolation that you're combining into this engine, and then you get the payoff. And because of that, I wanted people to be able to actually assemble those engines more reliably. If you're going to have Auramancer in your deck because it's really good with Parallax Wave, and otherwise Auramancer kind of sucks, then I want you to be able to find the Auramancer when you have Parallax Wave, or vice versa. Find the Parallax Wave when you have the Auramancer to actually assemble these combos. And in the year and a half of drafting this cube, I have fielded plenty of complaints about cards, about archetypes, about balance, but nobody has complained about a tutor as of yet once, because I don't think that, especially in that cube, I've had the experience of just them going and getting a specific card every single time and making the games completely repetitive.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a little bit of a reporting bias there, though. People will not complain so much about Brainstorm being super powerful because it's not the actual card that you lose to, even if it is the card that is quietly making a deck much better and much more consistent, but some other card is actually dealing the damage to you, so you're going to point at that. And I think that people also recognize the sort of iconic status and how they fit within the whole sort of theme and vibe of that cube. There's also an interesting sort of other aspect to this, which is that we're talking about some of these cards like Demonic Tutor, which just let you get any card at all, which if we are saying this is a problem, there is a risk there that the games are just going to play out similarly because you're just going to get your most powerful card. There's a lot of knobs you can turn to address that you've kind of touched on a couple of them. One is just playing more conditional tutors. If you have something that can just get enchantments, for example, you're not necessarily just going to get your one big scary creature every time.
See, this is where I'll disagree. I think Demonic Tutor is, first of all, the most powerful of all the tutors. I have a little power ranking we can talk about at the end of the episode, but I think Demonic Tutor is in a tier all of its own, and it's one of the only tutors I would play in basically any environment. Yes, Vampiric Tutor is really good. Yes, it's banned and restricted, and it's a huge problem in Constructed. But if you're playing a super fair environment, I think Vampiric Tutor becomes substantially worse. And Demonic Tutor is never bad, because 2 mana, draw a card is fine. When it's draw exactly what you need, it's also fine. I think of all those tutors, though, that's the one where you're most likely to go get a basic land or go get something else because you need to. When you have the conditional tutors, if your best card fits that condition, then it's way more likely to just go and get that best card every time.
I see what you're saying. Maybe I'm more thinking about it from a cube designer perspective, that you have a little bit more control over what the things that are being fetched are.
That's definitely true, yeah.
So it's okay, I want to make this cool, weird enchantment a real thing in this cube, giving you tutors that specifically can get just that card and not also just get the big dumb creature that is always good on parity or when you're ahead or when you're behind. So I think it changes a lot, sort of the dynamics of it if you're using restrictive tutors.
It does feel like you're giving up a lot to your players if you just put a Demonic Tutor or a Vampiric Tutor in. You're just hope you don't break it.
Yeah.
Whereas if going to the other end of the spectrum, Stoneforge Mystic is a very narrow tutor. Equipments are very narrow. You can very carefully control the power level of Stoneforge Mystic by just not including Cauldra, not including Batterskull, not including Skullclamp or Jite, right? Then the card is just...
Then it's much easier to say, well, I'm going to include instead Lion Sash and Glimmer Lens and say, okay, this is either your Grave Hate or your card advantage engine in a white deck, and that gives you a lot more of that toolboxy thing. So,
which is exactly what I do in the Bud Magic Cube. I don't have Cauldra or Batterskull because I don't like the combo play pattern of Stoneforge Mystic, but I do love it as a toolbox where you can draft specific pieces that you're going to get a different one depending on context.
Yeah, and I think that these two things pair really well together. If you have a tutor that is conditional, so you can structure one of the actual targets for it, then you can also structure those targets to be things that are very different on different boards so that you do kind of have that toolboxy feeling, which I personally think is a lot more fun than just every game I'm going to get the same Cauldron Complete.
And I think that's an example where, like, if you do have Cauldron in your deck, you're just going to get Cauldron pretty much every time.
Totally, yeah.
It's really hard to imagine a cube context where even if my opponent has a graveyard that matters,
it's like, oh, I really need Lion Sash to get rid of your
whatever. Is it still
whatever.
better than, can I just not ignore that and kill you with Cauldron? I'll probably just do the latter in most cases. So I think the Neoclassical Cube was a lesson in the fact that you can think of very narrow cards like Stoneforge Mystic and design in that hyper-specific parameters to make it as powerful as you want it to be, make it function the way you want it to function. You can also just expand that purview and do the same thing to a whole cube, right? Like, Demonic Tutor is in the Neoclassical Cube, as is Vampiric Tutor. They are both in from the first version of the list, and I think in that cube, you are very often using them conditionally to go and get whatever you need at the right moment. I have Demonic Tutor for plenty of lands, and that's part of why the card is great, to be honest. Like, people,
it's a pretty good cantrip.
People sometimes will be like, oh, Demonic Tutor, I had to go get a basic land. That sucks. It's like, no, that's why the card is good, because sometimes you need a basic land. That is one of the reasons the card is really strong. I got a little distracted here, but just to put a nice bow on my point, I was saying that you can apply that same logic of tuning the power level of a conditional tutor like Stoneforge Mystic to an entire cube list. In the Neoclassical Cube, I just don't include proactive power outliers that are self-contained. So you can never Demonic Tutor in any deck for a card that just is good on any board state. They don't really exist, certainly not in the same sense as they do in Modern Magic. And because the entire cube is designed around that constraint, the tutors in that cube function very differently than they would in a cube with more typical power patterns that we see in Modern Magic. Back to the show. The other thing they enable, though, which I actually do like, and this comes back to that irregular cube discussion, is that sometimes I think it is very powerful and interesting in a dynamic, not repetitive way to let somebody draft a totally different type of deck around a card they can have more reliable access to.
Yeah, there's such a difficult tension to this, because I know exactly what you're saying. It's like, staying power, if you're going to build your whole deck around it, your deck is going to be a lot worse because you're going to be taking these weird cards. I don't know, it's ridiculous we're using this silly card as the example, but I think we'll stick with it. So, like, you need to motivate your players to actually want to be able to do that, and if drawing it naturally in any game is just not enough to actually motivate them, your players will just not put staying power in a deck and never build around it ever.
To put it another way, like, as a cube designer, would you have been upset for me to have had an Enlightened Tutor in my deck on Tuesday?
No.
I suspect not.
Tutor.
I suspect not, because that is essentially using the tutor to accomplish one of the goals of that cube, right? If it let me staying power more, then I think it would be meeting its goals. The reason you haven't included it is because you're afraid that people will not do that, and instead they'll just go and get
something else.
whatever that is not necessarily the focus or the fun you're trying to lead people to, that then blows up your goals a little bit.
Right, that isn't like the cool story moment of I built all around this and it made me build a deck that was completely novel. Instead, it's just this big dumb threat. So there is that tension of, like, we're saying in some ways they sort of reduce variance and reduce variation and variety and make the games more the same, but it also opens up space to potentially allowing people to draft completely novel decks, which is, in a broader sense, very much enhancing the variety that you get.
Yeah, one of the episodes we had Ryan Sachs on, he said something I thought was a great, concise summary of this exact point, which was, we were talking about Splinter Twin combo specifically, and we were saying, like, yeah, if you include Splinter Twin combo in a cube, like, we've never done it because we feel like it just means that those cards only matter with those other cards, and then your deck becomes all about that. And Ryan was like, right, but that means you can include 2 cards in your cube that give you a whole different blue-red deck you can draft now, where maybe blue-red is normally like a tempo, Delver style, like aggro deck, but now I give you 2 cards, and you just draft 2 of them, and now your lens of how you approach the whole rest of the draft is completely shifted.
It is, how do you create an environment where you give your players a lot of agency to do different things within the same archetype? And where I differ with respect to what you said is actually in those A plus B combos. For me, one of the things that I find very interesting is the way that, blue-red control is drafted differently when you have twin and when you don't. and how it, not as like a dedicated combo deck, but as like a control deck that has both of those pieces, and how you draft differently simply because you did take a twin or a Pestermite early on, and you might not get the piece, but you'll still have a fully functional blue-red control deck at the end of the draft, whether or not you get it. But how you navigate that towards different axes of a particular archetype is one of the parts of drafting cubes that I find the most fun. You can do a lot more with it, arguably, when the cards aren't as powerful as it is in Vintage Cube, but I do think in Vintage Cube there's plenty of single cards, few little packages that you can do that give your players a lot of different ways to express themselves through the same, let's call it a macro strategy.
That is the promise, I think, of what you can accomplish, the variety that tutors can actually introduce.
Right. And I like in this example thinking of something like Enlightened Tutor or Idyllic Tutor, which let you get your enchantment but not necessarily your creature, because it just does, again, as the cube designer, give you a lot of opportunities to fine-tune that and say, hey, here's my enchantment section, this is where I want to put those weird wacky build-arounds, and give you tools to find them, but not force me to have to also be so precise about the threats that I put in other card types.
It does give you control there. Although, again, I have really appreciated, I guess maybe the additional pressure that having tutors in the Neoclassical cube specifically has put on me. Like I said at the beginning, I don't want to include any like individual carry the game on their own value generating power outliers that you just draw them and cast them and that's all you have to do. And if I were to include one or two of them, it would be much more readily evident because I do have a fair number of ways in that environment to tutor things up. And so if I were just to drop in a Minskimbu, that would happen a lot more than it would if I didn't have the tutors, and it would be much more obviously a problem. So in some ways, it's like holding myself accountable. It's like, I say I want this to be an environment where synergy matters and where the power outliers are enablers and not payoffs. And so if I want that to actually be true, put in a lot of cards that make people tutor and see if they're actually tutoring for the things you want, right? Instead of these just random, self-contained cards that don't meet the goals that I've stated for the cube.
Right. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's worth punctuating a little bit the fact that this is all sort of up to your goals, and I think you and I have pretty similar tastes in the scope of Magic players for the kind of games that we're trying to create in a lot of our cubes, and I think for a lot of other people, it's just like, no, I want my decks to be more consistent. I obviously want to just be able to do the thing and have my most powerful card every time, and if that's the kind of Magic you're looking for, then that's
there's no point in having that
well.
conversation, honestly. If you want to play the most powerful cards in Magic's history, put Demonic Tutor, Mystical Tutor, Vampiric Tutor in your cube. And maybe Enlightened Tutor, depending on what else you got going on.
Maybe Gamble. Gamble's fun to play with, actually.
Gamble's fun. I don't know if I put it in the category of ones you should play if your only goal is to power max things. But that conversation is so much less interesting to me than the one about how the presence or absence of tutors impacts your cube design decisions and impacts the environment and how it plays from a texture perspective. Because, again, in the Neoclassical cube, I have really liked them because it's felt like I have just multiple Stoneforge Mystic style cards that allow my players to see through the matrix and look at the cube list with an entirely different perspective and say, okay, if I can Enlighten Tutor for Parallax Wave in most games, how does that change my perspective of what I'm going to draft? Or if I can Demonic Tutor for my Tinker, now I actually can build a Tinker deck instead of just relying on drawing Tinker and having these big cards I can never cast otherwise. That has been a really rewarding sort of play pattern in that cube specifically.
Yeah, Tinker's an interesting example, and I might also put Natural Order there, where actually specifically in this same cube that we were drafting, I do have Natural Order as a rare card that sometimes gets shuffled into the cube, and there just aren't a lot of targets for it, so again, it's one of these situations where it's like, I think it's mostly a trap, but I did do it last time we drafted this cube and had 2 reasonable targets for it, but it was definitely something that you have to draft around. But it's like a more extreme example of a card where it's not just about, do I have these 2 cards in play? I just need to have it in my deck. So, or, last week I even drafted Arkham Dagson and Parhelion, and it was like, I'm putting this Parhelion in my deck. It literally does nothing if I draw it. I just need it with this other card. And that was just a very novel draft experience for me.
Yeah, honestly, it almost reminds me of some of the like hidden agenda conspiracies where it's like Patrick and Tuesday had the one in his deck where you could play 1 off-color card. To choose a card name, you can spend mana of any color to cast that card. That's a really interesting thing. It lets you say, okay, I've got this deck doing this type of thing in this color combination. Now I get to include 1 card that just like breaks the color pie and does something that otherwise these colors would not have access to. How can I maximize that the most? And it means that, you have 1 card in your list that's only there because of the presence of this other card. It's not quite the same because in a tutor case, you do have to draw one of them or both of them. But that sort of context shift, I think, is the biggest value they provide from a cube design perspective. And I think it's a really cool one in a lot of cubes. I'm still not sure I would like, let's just say, Demonic Tutor in the Bun Magic Cube. I don't know if it would be oppressive. I don't know if we ran 500 matches, if it would like have a super high win rate. I'm not sure of any of that. I just don't know if what it provides is worth any sort of risk of having a bigger power level outlier. Because in that cube, there aren't the same kind of build-arounds and synergy cards that you can like totally change your perspective on, because I designed it to not be like that.
Yeah, I mean, there is also, in the scope of things, minor cost in terms of tempo. Like, you are paying an extra 2 mana for your spell, so in the Bun Magic Cube, which is very fast, I wonder if it would be, I'm not saying bad, but less good than it would be in some other very powerful cubes.
I have seen people argue in Magic forums about whether or not Demonic Tutor is good in Cube or Limited, because they're like, well, I gotta pay 2 mana for a card. Like, how good is any card if if you take the mana cost and add 2 to it?
I mean, the real thing that you said, I think, is like, sometimes you do tutor for land,
get a
and
land.
just like the power of saying, oh, I can keep this 2-lander with confidence, that's gotta raise your win rate a lot, right?
Yeah, and the one I have come closest to testing in the Bun Magic Cube is Mystical Tutor, and that was specifically because for a while there, longtime listeners will remember that I was looking for a way to bolster control specifically. And I felt that Mystical Tutor was a card that would be much better in control decks than other decks in the Bun Magic Cube, because if you're playing a like blue deck that's a tempo deck, you're playing a Delver style deck, you don't want to spend a turn and a card, because Mystical Tutor does not replace itself. You don't want to spend both those resources just to, draw a slightly better burn spell than you would have drawn otherwise, right? Like, you want redundancy. You want a lot of cantrips. You want a lot of counter spells. You want a lot of burn spells. Drawing any specific one of those is probably not often worth the tempo and mana cost of casting the Mystical Tutor. Whereas a control deck that has 2 board wipes and 2 big card draw spells, the conditionality is so much more important there. And you will also be holding up mana more, and so you won't have to take a tempo hit because you were already holding up mana for a counter spell, then you didn't have to spend it, so now you have free time to cast that Mystical Tutor. So for those reasons, I got closest to trying Mystical Tutor in the Bun Magic Cube, and if I wasn't able to get control to where I wanted to be with the other things I tried, I probably would have given it a shot for that exact reason. Let's talk a little bit about the 100 Ornithopters cube.
Okay, so we have 100 Ornithopters. You might need some more Ornithopters, so let's put in a Fabricate, and we got 101
I did have
Ornithopters.
Artificer's Intuition in there at first, and I was like, well, this can discard Ornithopters to find more Ornithopters. And then I was like,
Neat.
what am I doing with that? It definitely is moving game pieces around.
What have you considered Assembly Hall for the Ornithopters cube?
What does that do?
It's a 5-mana artifact, as you know, from Mercadian Masks. Reveal
I
a
can
creature
picture the art actually perfectly. It's like a little cottage in the woods with these big eyes in the sky over
How
it. Yeah.
can you do that? Reveal a creature card in your hand, search your library for a copy of that card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library for 4 mana. So you're paying 9 mana for the first Ornithopter you get.
No, yeah.
Yeah, you should do it for sure.
If you could just reveal it and then just for 0 mana just do it over and over again, it was just 5 mana draw all my Ornithopters, then I think it would be in the discussion, but still not necessarily amazing. Like, Thrumming Stone is basically that. If you have enough Ornithopters in your deck, you just cast one and then you cast them all, and they're all just in play, which is...
That does sound fun.
It's going to be cool. Anyway, this is a cube where the only creatures in the entire cube are 100 copies of the card Ornithopter. There are no creature lands, there are no creature tokens. If you have a creature in play, it is the card Ornithopter. This naturally evolves into a...
Call back to the Volver cycle.
Into a synergy-based, kind of combo-oriented environment, because, yes, every creature is an Ornithopter. The more important thing is this is a cube that includes 100 0-mana artifacts, and there's a lot more powerful things you can do with 100 0-mana artifacts than just putting in equipment on your Ornithopter and attacking, which is still a deck I support, to be clear, but you can also do a bunch of other more synergistic nonsense. And in that cube, I went even deeper on tutors, partially because this cube has no aesthetic restriction to old school Magic, so like Beseech the Mirror, all that stuff's getting right in there, but also because this is a cube where I want to absolutely maximize that aspect we were talking about, where you can essentially build a whole deck around a specific card. And I think there's a lot of different cards in that cube that you can build a whole deck around, like way more, like, I don't know, like a few dozen that you could build a whole deck around. So at any given draft, the vast majority of those decks are not going to be drafted, right? Someone's going to have that card that could be a whole deck just in their deck as a regular role player, or it's going to be, in their sideboard because they can't play it or they didn't get there. But then in some games, some drafts, some matches, someone's going to do it. They're going to say, this is the draft where I got 18 copies of Ornithopter, and I got my Glimpse of Nature, my Rites of Harmony, and I'm going to take tutors for those cards because now I can just draw my whole deck very consistently as soon as I get either of these cards in my hand. I have not played this cube yet, so I can't weigh in on how successful this has been to my goals, but I definitely designed that cube from the ground up with this assumption, and it totally changed my ideas of what were possible and what could potentially be viable. I have a card like Remembrance in there. This is a 4-mana white enchantment that says when a creature dies, you can go search your library for a creature with the same name and put it into your hand.
That sounds like that thing you said before.
There's a couple cards that do a similar thing. It's when a creature dies, so this basically is a combo with any sack outlet, but even then...
It's a combo in that you can do that.
Well, you can do it for as many times as you have Ornithopters in your whole deck.
Right.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, definitely. You can entomb all your artifacts.
You can also just sacrifice them all to Goblin Bombardment and just kill your opponent. Like there's sack outlets that are much better than just
you're gonna have to draft
putting
a
them all
lot
in your
of
graveyard.
You gotta draft a lot of Ornithopters, huh?
Well, yeah, I think in that case you want 10 to 12 Ornithopters, and you also want a couple ways to get them all back from your graveyard, an Echoing Return, a Yawgmoth's Will, or something, and then you just do that. Or what I really hope someone pulls off is Pia's Revolution plus Remembrance. Pia's Revolution says whenever an artifact you control goes to the graveyard, you either put it back in your hand or your opponent loses 3 life. They have 2 options. And
so you just say, I keep doing this, and you're allowed to make either choice. Either I do this forever or you lose.
Yeah.
Great.
I think it's pretty cool.
I feel like there's some... I have questions about this. I would want to ask a judge before I did this at CubeCon.
What judge question would you have?
About if you technically would just draw are you forced to eventually have to take a different action?
What
I
do
don't
you
know.
mean?
There's some weird stuff about repeating. If
I sacrifice an Ornithopter to Goblin Bombardment.
Okay.
You're now at 19. There's a Pia's Revolution trigger on the sack.
You can have it. You can have it back.
Okay, I do it again.
You can have it back.
I do it again.
Okay, we've done this 3 times now. Is the game a draw?
No, the game state is progressing. You're losing life.
Unless... No, I'm not losing life.
I'm sacrificing it to Goblin Bombardment. You're losing 1 life each time.
I forgot about the Goblin Bombardment.
You gotta have something to sacrifice it to.
Sure.
And the thing you sacrifice it to is always going to progress the game. Either I'm making a mana with Phyrexian Altar, I'm dealing damage with Goblin Bombardment, I'm milling you out with Grinding Station.
Okay. Yes. I'm back with you.
Yeah, if I had a sack outlet that was just...
Viscera Seer, but not a creature.
Look at your deck.
Look at your deck.
Yeah, that would be... I mean, Viscera Seer even scries. You could stack your whole deck if you just let me keep doing it.
Fair.
I guess it only scries 1 at a time. Can you stack a whole deck if you're only moving 1 card at a time?
No.
Because you can never change the order. 2 at a time you definitely could.
2 at a time you could, and it would be laborious.
It would be very laborious. This is all to say that the tutors, I think, are an essential part of that environment and an essential part of what I expect that cube to be. Because I want you to be able to make Remembrance work. And in a normal deck that doesn't have sack outlets, Remembrance is not very good. It says if your Ornithopter dies, you can go get another one, which your Ornithopter's dying in combat, and if that's the case, is the limiting point of this game really that you just want another Ornithopter? I don't think it's a very good card in a normal deck that isn't built around it. And the same goes for many, many, many other cards in that list. So in that sense, Tutors had opened up a whole different type of cube design to me that wouldn't be possible had I not included a bunch of them.
Yeah, it's not a straightforward topic, and it is this tension between creating variety by reducing some variety is interesting.
So where I sit today on Tutors, if there's someone listening that's a new cube designer and they're like, okay, great, you all have just said a bunch of complicated things about Tutors at me, what is the takeaway here? I think if you are striving for balance in terms of power level, if your goal is I want there to be a very narrow range of power level cards, I want everyone's little micro decisions to matter a whole lot, I think you really have to question what value Tutors are giving you in a cube design like that. And I think as a base assumption, you should just avoid them if you are trying to aim for this small edge gameplay where people are getting these little edges by playing their cards in the right sequence and the games are really close. If you are designing a cube that is built around synergy, I think what I'm starting to feel more and more is that I would actually lean more towards including Tutors, and I think a lot of people that think they have a synergy cube will maybe put tutors in it and realize that actually synergy is not what is deciding games. This is, I think, a common mistake of early cube designers is saying they want a synergy cube and then loading it up with Thunderball Hellkites, the same way that we talked about with Sam a few weeks ago. This is a very common thing people end up doing because they like these cards. Half the reason they have a cube is they want to play with them, and they might not have an ability to understand how they will impact the power level of the environment. And it's way faster to figure out if you've made a mistake in terms of meeting your goals of making synergy be the thing that decides games if you let people find their cards more often. So it's a way to like keep you accountable in your cube design, and it's also a way to make the synergy decks better. If the Thunderball Hellkite is a little better than everything else, but not a lot better, then maybe the deck that's tutoring for their synergistic thing can actually still beat the Thunderball Hellkite, where without the tutor, it wouldn't be consistent enough to compete with the fair things that the cube is doing.
Yeah, I can see how it could go both ways and sort of reveal more cleanly what the actual things that are winning games are and sort of, yeah, make that more obvious.
And then we've said so many times on this show, and I still maintain that maybe the most fun thing about designing a cube is when a player does something unexpected drafting your environment, combines cards in a way you did not anticipate to make something new, and I can think of no better way to make that happen more often than including more tutors.
I mean, that's difficult to say because it's like, what are you going to be surprised by your players doing? It's like, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if that wasn't what was going to happen.
Okay, sure.
This is
what
my
I'm saying,
top tier weasel.
I guess what I'm saying is that I think even though you and I have explicitly distanced ourselves from the power-focused idea of cube design, we've just said that that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in designing and creating our own games based on our own goals. I think there's so much inherited knowledge that's like steeped into the cube design world. And one of those pieces of knowledge is that tutors are really powerful. And I think that I and you both excluded tutors from the Bun Magic Cube and from the regular cube and from all of our other cube projects, largely in part because we felt that they would be power outliers because that has been the inherited assumptions about these cards for so long in cube circles, which is true in a lot of environments. But I think if they didn't have that stigma, if they didn't have that stink on them of just being generically powerful cards where you always want to pack one, pick one demonic tutor, their actual implications on the draft and gameplay may actually fit way more of our goals as stated than we would otherwise be willing to accept.
Sure. I definitely see where you're coming from about that sort of like implicit association with certain things maybe we're not interested in. Can I levy a couple other criticisms against tutors?
Please, I hope you do.
Specifically in the context of the regular cube, which is different from the cube we were talking about earlier. Don't worry about it.
Maybe worry about it a little bit.
So I'm talking about in my main cube, which is pretty low power, and it's especially designed to be pretty accessible. We have a lot of people that come through our local cube nights, and I want, the very skilled players to sit down and have a good time with it, but also be pretty accessible to the newer players.
And you succeed beautifully in this.
I think
goal.
I will take that compliment. And I think that tutors really do go against that in a couple ways. I mean, one way is just like the logistics of it. It's also like a cube that we want to play regularly, and having more cards that just shuffle your library is a small negative. I think more importantly for the kind of gameplay experience, though, very experienced players will be much more benefited by having tutors than the less experienced players because they're able to identify what those power outliers and potentially build a toolbox in a way that other players couldn't. And I think that especially for someone who's newer to the game, coming to Cube Night and having that experience of, oh, you just are going to get that particular card and beat me with it every single time is disproportionately frustrating.
But you're assuming that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I'm saying I think your assumption that that's what would happen is perhaps unfounded and just based in this idea that tutors are really powerful and they must be really powerful because they always get your best thing. And I think the regular cube is a environment that is in balance enough that your best thing is not going to be worth like just your raw best thing without any synergy or any like conditionality is probably not worth 2 extra mana in the regular cube. Like back when Feather was the best thing to do, would you play a 5 mana Feather?
No, but would I play a 2 mana and then a 3 mana Feather? Maybe. Yeah, probably.
But I don't think that would then still be the best card necessarily, especially considering you got to play 3 colors if we're talking about Demonic Tutor specifically in that case.
Okay, Feather also being full devotion also makes that a little bit more challenging.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like I I must have been hurt by tutors in the past, and that sort of experience of like, they're also like, I think more difficult cards to play with because you do need to build your deck to understand what it is you're tutoring for. And
I think it really does depend on context, though. Like, yes, I hear everything you're saying about experienced players, but I think it's really hard. I don't know that I agree that it's going to benefit experienced players more. It's going to be a thing that is a way for your players to express their skill, but that's true of putting removal spells in your cube. The experienced players are going to know where to use them more. That's true of anything that involves any, like, layer of decision making that's not cast my spell and hope it works. So I don't know if I buy that completely. And what I'll say in defense of, we'll say specifically Demonic Tutor, just to keep this simple, a card like Demonic Tutor would be very obviously a high pick that even a less experienced player would probably know, hey, this is very good. I recognize this one. I don't have to read this one to know what it does. This one's probably pretty good. I see this one as a staple in, Commander. This is just a good card. So they're less likely to pass a card that is actually a power outlier that a more experienced player is able to identify, but they're not. And then also, the more narrow tutors really reward people that are experienced with the cube. If I see Sphinx Summoner in a pack, and I have never drafted this cube before, I have no idea what this could possibly do. Is this a combo card? Do I go and get something that goes infinite? Do I go and get some bomb that is like really powerful in my deck that is just going to take over the whole game? Or is it a weird conditional toolbox? I just don't know what it does, which...
Sure. I mean, but on the other hand, the fact that it is more narrow is a little bit more of a guided experience. It just says, go get an artifact creature. You're going to be looking for making sure you have 3 or 4 artifact creatures in your deck, and I think that is like much easier to see than how am I going to use a Demonic Tutor when it could be anything at all. I don't know. I wish I had a better way to articulate it, but I really do feel like they will benefit the more skilled players, not just to a high degree, but also in a way that will feel more repetitive and frustrating. And I mean, we're talking about a pretty narrow context of like a certain type of play group, a certain dynamic approaching a certain type of cube. But in that case, I just do feel confident in that. I mean, we could try it. We could just put in Demonic Tutor and see what happens.
I think it's good to continue to remind people that people should just try stuff.
Yeah.
Because the actual stakes are extremely low to putting Demonic Tutor in for 3 drafts if you wanted to answer this question. I hear your criticisms, and I'm not arguing we should put Demonic Tutor in the regular cube, more because I don't really know what it adds as more than I'm worried that it will detract things from the cube. But I do think that your fear, you say you've been burned, I think maybe you've been burned a lot in your head.
Maybe, okay, yeah, and so let's build off that. Is maybe another issue that I have with tutors is just as a less experienced player, and
they definitely can make you feel like you're doing it wrong.
That's it.
More than other cards.
I legitimately have in the past, especially when I was newer to drafting, been like, here's a Demonic Tutor. I know this card is powerful, but I don't want to look like an idiot and
you don't have to reveal the card.
Know which card I'm tutoring
Demonic Tutor
for.
you don't have to reveal.
But
so
sometimes they ask you, and sometimes you forget, and you tell them.
Patrick always asks you, and you always have to remember to tell him to go
you don't
pound
have
sand.
to answer that question. But yeah, I mean, I think they are also just like potentially difficult cards to play with, and it's not just, it's like a lot more time to resolve than just getting a fetch land, because you have to think about what you're doing, and unless you are the kind of deck builder that has already figured out what your plan is and understands what your targets are for a card, it can just be frustrating and difficult and not necessarily fun to all players.
Yeah, and I think your point about wanting to limit the amount of tutor effects for logistical reasons is very reasonable. You do have a fair number of things that require you to go through your library, find a specific kind of card, and do something with it, so it's not like you're willing to have none of that, but that's not to say that you should just have more, because if you have an amount that you're comfortable with, that makes sense.
Yeah.
The other things I'll say in defense of these cards is, like, Demonic Tutor is one of the cleanest cards of all time. Like,
that's true.
There's a reason they made it in alpha, because it is so obvious. It's natural to have a card that just says, go get a card out of your deck that is what you need right now. And that purity is beautiful. It really is. So I really like that about it compared to, Goblin Engineer, which is cool, but also it's like, all right, I got to go think about this and think about that, and how do I use this, blah, blah, blah. Where Demonic Tutor is just like, you just go do the thing. It's so clear.
Just do the thing. Draw whatever card you want.
In conclusion, I now see tutors much more as a tool that can be used in designs regardless of power level. I think really my big revelation is just that you can really detach the power level of Demonic Tutor in a Eternal Cube at the peaks of power level. It truly is like the definition of a card that scales with the environment. Like it doesn't do anything except for go get you another card of the environment. So there's really no way that you could ever look at a card like Demonic Tutor and say that it has this absolute power level. The way that, everything matters in terms of context, but a card like Oko is just, if your opponent has permanence or hopes to have permanence at some point in the game that are not lands, Oko is going to be very, very good in a way that does not really scale, right? Like, Oko in a low-power environment is just even more broken than it is in a high-power environment. So I see them now as design tools and am much more willing to play with them because of this hard-to-define aspect where even though they may seem fundamentally to make the game more consistent, make your deck more consistent, more repetitive, they actually allow for a much bigger, broader diversity where, sure, maybe in a given draft, I'm always going and getting staying power, and maybe that is tedious for one draft, but in the next draft, my Enlightened Tutor is going to go get a whole different card, and that means I can draft a whole different deck, which means that as we play this cube week over week in the play group, it becomes stale much slower because there's actually way more things and way more variety of what you can actually do in that cube consistently in a way that you're actually rewarding. Because to bring it all back around, I will never take staying power in the regular cube ever again. I'm not doing this to...
More for me.
I'm not doing this to spite you. I've never seen anybody do anything good with it. I tried my best, and I am convinced it's a full-on trap. And if your goal is to make the fun thing the right thing to do, I think staying power is a failure in that regard, because I will never try and do it ever again, because I don't think the cube rewards it.
I think... No, that would be too mean.
Everyone
Fair.
wants you to say the mean thing.
I accept your
Everyone listening wants you to say
criticism.
the mean thing. It's truly like, it is just feedback as a player.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this to be spiteful. I'm just saying that, like, I feel like I have learned that type of deck does not work if I am just relying on one card in my 40 cards that I hope to draw. So I won't. I will just draft what you drafted, which is just like a pile of ambiguously good cards that maybe interact with each other instead of trying to do what I perceived to be the irregular thing.
All right, I accept your criticism, and I accept it only as a challenge. And I will draft staying power next time. Maybe I'll seed it into the rare slots.
I would support this, and I will not be drafting it. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Was that useful, people? Let us know if that was useful. I feel like we said a lot of things, and it's easy for us to get lost in the abstract sauce, but we're always trying to bring it back to something practical that you can actually apply to your own cube design project. So let us know if we actually succeeded in that in the comments, or...
Are we trying to do that?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. What are you trying to do?
Oh, I don't know. I'm just like scrolling around on Scryfall. Looking at Gathan Raiders on the cube map.
I mean, I think it's...
2% of cubes play Gathan Raiders, by the way, which is more than I expected.
Yeah, I mean, the most cubed card is what, like 30% of cubes?
What is that going to be?
It's Lightning Bolt or
Birds of Paradise?
I think it's actually Llanowar Elves at last
it.
check. 30, 40% of cubes?
44%.
Yeah, so I mean, it's 5% of the most popular cards percentage of cubes that play that thing.
Yeah, that's useful. Speaking of useful.
Where does it fall in the list of all Magic cards of all time, in the density of cubes that they're played in?
Oh, it's somewhere deep, deep, deep in the long tail.
No, I bet it's in the top 20%.
Looking up staying power. Staying power 1%.
Oh, well, now I have to ask how numbers are being rounded.
748 cubes versus... Okay, well, now we're definitely not giving anything useful.
Yeah.
Go check out the cube map. It's fun.
All right, we're done here. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Anthony, and I think really hard about Magic cards, speaking to microphones about it. Thanks for making this podcast with me, Anthony. And I'm sorry I got salty about the thing. I just wanted to do the thing. I didn't get to do the thing.
It's okay.
It's not your fault. It's not anybody else's fault. It's just the universe varianced me.
Again,
a moment where I was vulnerable.
I was just as salty during the draft, and, I got to be incredibly smug during the game. So it's all a wash in the end.
I was having so much fun during the draft. Truly, I really was. That was part of the problem. I got my expectations up. I was like, look, I did the thing. I get to prismatic strands, and I just never got to do that.
I mean, I've just been enjoying this cube more, even though I've not even really done any editing on it, but it's like the fact that we have these weird wacky cards and these interactions came up like the previous time we drafted. I got to use Magical Hacker on my opponent's Ethereal Absolution, and they're just like, I'm happy for you that you have an answer to my Unbeatable Bahamut. It's bizarre.
I think a lot of people, that's what they are excited about cubes, those kind of story moments.
Yeah.
That's not me, frankly, which is why I was bummed you didn't have the regular cube, because we play cube every single week, and I feel like I've played a lot of Magic, and I don't need to be like, I got Ulvenwald Trackered and Phyrexian Obliterator. Isn't that crazy? It's like, no, it's not that crazy.
It's
just
kind of crazy.
It's really powerful.
It's pretty crazy if you think about it.
It really does completely negate every decision I made in the game up to that point very effectively.
No. You're thinking Phyrexian Negator. This obliterates.
Obliterates all my decisions. They're gone.
Obliterates your decisions.